Next up, we got Lou Vega, who has a really cool story. Did I pronounce your name correctly, by the way? So, beans to breeches, right? And coffee to AppSec, which I'm let him tell the story, but I'm sure there's some other people in here that have a connector that doesn't sound like it goes together with cybersecurity.
Hey, good evening. This is From Beans to Breeches, what a coffee maker can teach us about getting started with application security. And how many people think that this is going to be about hacking a coffee maker? Okay, good, because it's not. I had one person ask me that, and I said, unfortunately not. We're not hacking a coffee maker. We're talking instead about the mindset that is required to get these things working. And one of the things that this is talking about is the mindset that goes into application security testing. As an application security tester, I often get asked from people that are trying to get into it, how do I get started with application security? I look at a CTF or something, there's a website, and I'm trying to hack this website. Where do I start? And this talk stemmed from when my coffee maker actually broke. How can this coffee maker actually teach you about getting started with application security? And what it stemmed from is that my coffee maker broke one time, and I started thinking about how does it actually work. Anybody here is a skateboarder? Perfect. Lifelong skateboarder? Yeah? So if you look at this and you're not a skater, you just see something kind of boring. It's like a loading dock, some handrails, some steps. If you're a skater though, you're like, oh wow, there's a whole bunch of opportunity here. I can wall ride that wall. I can board slide down the handrail. I can grind down the handrail. I can do different types of grinds down the handrail. I can ollie over the steps. There's a whole bunch of stuff. A whole world opens up if you think about it from the mindset of a skateboarder. If you think about it from the mindset of a pedestrian, it's boring. So you look at the same thing with a website. You got a login form. You know what it is, but what is it doing under the hood, right? So if you're asked to hack this, some people are like, well, that's kind of boring. I don't want to hack that. It's the login form. What can I do with it? And from some people's perspective, not a whole lot. But with the right mindset, there's a lot going on there that is possible. So where do you begin? If you're going to hack this website, where might you start? Anybody? There you go. He's going to go right for the guts. SQL injection on the email address. All right. That might work. We don't know until we try it, right? Sure. So you might be trying to gauge valid users versus invalid users. You know, if I put in an email address and it doesn't exist, do I get a generic error message? Or do I get something that's specific? Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff going on here. And one of the things I always say, I love starting out from something like this, because the other thing that most people don't think about, this being the login page, guess what? It's available to anybody on the internet that stumbles across that website. Some of the other stuff that you might do within this website, you can't get to it until you're a legal user of the website, until you have an account. If you can't get an account, you can still access this, and you might be able to get pretty far. So that, like I said, that stemmed from, you know what the coffee maker is, but you didn't think about how it does it, right? And so I didn't think about that either until my coffee maker broke. And I started thinking like, all right, I'm not an electrical engineer. I know it makes my coffee, but how does it do it? What's it doing under the hood to make my coffee? So I started thinking about it, broke it into some discrete little ports. Like, you know, there's obviously power coming in, some kind of inputs. There's a timer on there to make sure what time it's going to start my coffee in the morning. There's a heating element. There's a thermoregulator. So when the temperature gets to the right point, it's going to start the water over the stuff. And eventually I started thinking, okay, the coffee maker is not as complex as I thought it was when you start to break it into those little parts. So application security, kind of the same way. When you look at an application, and this one is much more involved, there's a whole lot going on in this application. You might become overwhelmed. You're like, where do I even start with this? There's so much stuff here that I could potentially mess with. Where do I start and how do I start? What am I going to do with these things that are up here? You know, there's a lot of stuff going on here. leads information. Can I click on anybody's account? Can I see other stuff?
Let's search bar.
But again, if you're not used to that mode of thinking, you might not be thinking of all of those different ways. So I see a page ripe for attacks here. There's just so much going on. So let's take a look at the mindset that we're going to take. Application security attacks is, by and large, three things that really get you your most mileage with application security. You've got input, processing, and storage. Okay, if you break applications down to a very basic level, they've got input, processing, and storage. Input is your chance as the attacker to control logic and flow through the software. So that email address that you're trying to SQL injection with before, the password, whatever you're typing into those pages, those points on the web page, that's your input that you're giving it to. Now, the developer expects you to put in an email address because it says email address. They expect you to put in a password. They expect that if you click that checkbox that says remember me, that's all you're going to do. But as an attacker, you don't have to put in an email address. You don't have to put in a password. You can put in a SQL command. You could put in something completely different and see how the application responds. Okay? When you think about it from a perspective of a web application and that login, the other thing that's going to happen is, how is that happening? So it's taken an email address and a password. What do you think the developer is going to do with that information once you get it? You're likely going to compare it to something that they have already stored, right? So they're going to have to do some kind of processing with that data that you send it. The other thing I've got listed there, if an application does any kind of file parsing, that's a fun bonus because that's input combined with the processing, and that can make for some really fun advanced type of attacks. The other thing with this, if you're just getting into application development or you've been in it for a little while, there's an old book in here, 24 Deadly Sins of Software Security. And of those 24 deadly sins in software security, at least 9 of those can be mapped back to input validation of some type, okay? Another 4 of them can be mapped back to generically processing data. So again, you can have a lot of stuff happen just by taking advantage of this very simple roadmap. Break it into just very simple parts: input, processing, and storage. What is the application doing under the hood? And then that becomes a very simple cycle. Craft your input. It goes into this black box, the software that you didn't write but you're trying to exploit. You observe the output that you get from that, and then repeat until breach. Okay? Not all the time that you put something in are you going to get the results you're looking for. I was just doing a web application pen test for a fairly mature company, and they had a lot of stuff that they were doing right. And I told them in the briefing that we gave them at the end, we found one high severity vulnerability in the application, and it wasn't in the code that they wrote, it was in how they implemented the authentication that they were using a third party for. So it wasn't even really their code, it was just the way they implemented it wrong. But their code actually was very resilient. And I told them that in the briefing. I said, it's frustrating as an attacker to try a whole bunch of stuff and laying down like what we tried. And we got nowhere with your software because you took our input, our malicious input, you rendered it harmless, and you gave us a generic error message, which from a developer's perspective, that's the best case scenario. An attacker's perspective, that's extremely frustrating because now, did my attack maybe work if I just tweak that payload a little bit? I don't know. And going along that line with those error messages, when I was a software developer, used to always like getting the error messages because that told me that my software was doing something slightly different and I was almost getting it ready to work. And when I finally got a different error message, that was cause for celebration. Okay, I fixed that last problem. Now I've got a new error message to figure out. And as an attacker, it's the same way. I get an error message, unexpected input on line 2 at column this, this database connection something error, right? Oh, I'm dealing with the database here. Great. It expected certain type of data. I put in a different type of data, and now it doesn't like it. So can I tweak that a little bit and get maybe more out of it? I actually did that with a client. They were using GraphQL as a back end for a lot of their API processing. And GraphQL has this neat feature, if you're a developer, where it does auto suggestions. If you type something almost like, did you mean to type this? And it gives those in error messages back. And so I actually used that to craft my attack, because the attack was to get a certain piece of data that they didn't give by default in the return. And I kept tweaking my payload and getting a slightly different error message until I finally got it right and I got the data back that I wanted. And of course that meant game over for them, because in that case I took back the administrator's accounts. And like I said, it's game over for them. They were floored that I did it using their own software against them by using their error messages. So, something to keep in mind. Looking back at this login form now, you might look at it a little differently. Can you put malicious data into that password field? Can you put malicious data into that login form? What about that Remember Me? I just had an application I did a couple of weeks ago where they had a similar thing to Remember Me on their page, but instead it set the time zone that you were in. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. They feel it's important enough in the application to set the time zone that they set a little thing. And when you set the time zone, it set a cookie on the machine that set your time zone, like English or EST -5 or GMT -5, whatever your time zone was. And I saw that same data reflected in the website. So I started thinking, well, if it's taking that, is it taking it straight from the cookie without doing anything with it? So I just changed the time zone to my name, Lou. And sure enough, on the website for the time zone, it just said Lou. I thought, wow, that's pretty awesome. But that's not very exciting from an attack standpoint. And as a business owner, when they get the message that, your hacker could put his name in there instead of the time zone, they're going to be like, whatever. But if you turn it into a cross-site scripting payload that can do something else, make a request on behalf of the user that's logged in, and maybe do something that they don't want you to do, and it all happens under the hood just by viewing that web page, all of a sudden they pay attention. And so you kind of elevate those things, try to get it to go a little bit further than just, Lou. But it all stemmed from just a simple cookie that was being set. The developer didn't think, I guess, that cookies are user controllable data, but of course it is. You can, if it's on your computer, you control it. Let's see, we also had, looking at this page, if you look at that page with the eye of a more seasoned software developer or web application pen tester, you see a lot of different areas. Like every one of those profiles has pictures. And pictures, if they're uploaded, they can be malicious too. Some web servers will process metadata in a picture they'll process it without validating it. And basically you can embed commands in a picture that can then get executed on a web server. Not all web servers, but if you see pictures in a web app, it's worth trying. You see stuff there with a lot of math stuff with the numbers. And one of my favorite things to do with applications that are dealing with money or numbers or anything like that is see how they handle negative values or see how they handle extremely large values. Eventually the application's gonna have a value that it can't handle. A lot of times that's int64 plus 1, max value plus 1. They've also got, can you click on any of those names and what happens when you click on those names? A lot of times you click on that name, you might see a number behind it. So if I click on one of those names there, the URL might just say, for Ray Miller, it'll say like /123. Well, if I change that 123 to 124, does it give me somebody else's account? And if it does, am I allowed to see that account? What if I put in a negative number? You've got stuff there with mail. Those send messages to other users. I actually had a one-click account takeover I did a couple weeks ago for a client. They had an internal mail feature within their application, and the text box, or where you can input the messages, had a stored cross-site scripting vulnerability in it. So what that means is I can, as the attacker, again, I can put my own program code in that message, and it's going to carry out when the viewer receives that message. So I thought, well, let's make this even more interesting. We're going to send a message to the administrator of the application. And then to make it even more interesting, we're going to, because they were doing another thing that they shouldn't be doing, they were storing the passwords in the application and returning those as part of the profile object. When you return your own profile, the password was returned as part of it. So I was like, I'm going to send him a message that under the hood takes his request, makes a request to his profile page, scrapes the password out of that, sends that to my attacker-controlled server on the cloud, and then, by the way, I'm going to change his password now that I know what his current password is. So he's no longer in his account. I also have a running list of passwords that have been used that I can use in password spraying attacks and other apps within the company. That got the company's attention a lot more than, popping up my name as a message box for a cross-site scripting. So some people are going to say, well, that's great, you got to have the right mindset, but there's got to be more to application security than just that. And of course there is. You're definitely going to have to, well, I recommend for people, if you're getting into application security, have a little bit of programming knowledge. I was a developer for 10 years before I got into application security. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you go out and become a developer for 10 years and then jump in. I'm just suggesting that you learn at least one language decent. All right, whether it's Python, Go, JavaScript, I don't care. Just learn a language and have a good mastery of it. Because after you learn one language, I can tell you as a software developer, most of the rest is just syntax. So if I learned one language well and I see code written in another language, once I understand a few of the key things about the syntax of that language, I can kind of understand what's happening in that code, even if I couldn't sit down and write that code. The other thing that's going to help with application security and with InfoSec in general is never stop learning. I had a talk with a guy a couple of years back. He had made the move into information security. He was an accountant beforehand, and he thought, I want to get into InfoSec. That's where the money is, that's where the jobs are. And he got into InfoSec. And then he's like, how do you do it? He's like, it's like drinking from a fire hose all the time. You constantly have to learn new stuff that's happening. He's like, in accounting, the laws might change, but he's like, numbers are still the same. Math still works the same. He's like, I'm actually leaving InfoSec and going back to accounting because I just can't deal with it. I was like, it's good that you found that out after 2 years rather than 10 years down the road that you don't like it. But definitely cultivate a curiosity for things around you. I tell people one of the things that I was starting, I got my start at the wrong time. When I graduated high school, people weren't hiring hackers in that time frame. I was also the kid that was always taking apart stuff. My dad would wake up on Saturday morning and I'd have some electronic device taken apart, and he's like, "You're gonna put that together, right?" Yeah, I'm gonna put it together, maybe. But he didn't squash the curiosity. I was always trying to figure out how things worked, and he didn't squash that, so that helped. The other thing, brush up on your written and spoken communications. A I always joke with people that are trying to get into the field, everybody wants to be a hacker until it's time to come to write the report. Okay? And it's true. You're not paid to hack, you're paid for the reports. And I told this to some high school students that I was mentoring. They said, oh, I can't stand my English teacher. I'm like, listen to your English teacher. She's going to guide you well, and you're going to have those skills when it comes time to deliver that report to the client. They're not going to pay top dollar for this crap report that looks like it was written by somebody in 7th grade that's texting their friend rather than a professional document. So pay attention to those things. Make sure that you can talk to your clients in a way that's engaging and collaborative rather than like you're trying to beat them up. Like, hey, we found this hack in your system, and so we're better than you. No, you're not better than them. You're on the same side as them. You want their stuff to be secure at the end of the day, just like they do. So you want to come at them from a perspective of helping them, not bashing them for whatever they have in their application. But that brings me to a close. I'm probably very early. But thank you. If there's any questions or comments, I'll gladly take them. If not, thanks for coming, and enjoy.